Hi, friends. This is Adam Shoemaker, Rector at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, back for another edition of Rector's Corner. And I'm very happy to have with me today the Reverend Leyla King, who is the canon for mission for small congregations in the Diocese of West Texas. She is also the author of a new book, a memoir titled Daughters of Palestine, a Memoir in 5 Generations. And we're going to be talking about that today. Leyla, thank you so much for making the time. Why don't you just begin by introducing yourself to those listening in and to tell us specifically sort of how you identify.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. Um, so I identify as a Palestinian American Episcopal priest. It's sort of taken me years to understand that identity, to be conscious of that identity, and to really understand it to the extent that I have by now. But it's been a really fulfilling vocation, and yeah, this book is relatively new. It was released in early July, and I'm really excited about it and really excited to share my grandmother's stories, which is most of the book, and my stories as well with the world, and particularly with other Christians here in the States and in the West more broadly.
It's a wonderful book, Leyla, and many people in my congregation who'll be listening in know something of my story. It really resonated with me, but sort of wonder about the origins of what led you to write this book, and why you chose to tell the story the way you did, structuring it through different generations of women in your family.
Yeah, so it was not an entirely conscious decision to write the book this way. And let me go back a little bit to talk a little bit about the origins of the book. So um, I sort of discovered that I am Palestinian quite late in life. I was maybe 14 or 15 years old, and that's another story that we can get into or not. But when I discovered that, I got really curious about what that means. I was very close to my Palestinian grandparents who lived about, you know, 10, 15 minutes from us, from my house in Houston, where I grew up. And so I started asking my grandmother about her experiences. And after I graduated from college, I I thought it was really important. My grandfather had died by then, and I was aware that I was at risk of losing any connection I had to their stories. And so I asked my grandmother if she would sit down with me the summer after I graduated from college and let me record her life story, basically. And I thought I would be recording her life story, which I did to some extent, but it turned out that she was really the keeper of the stories for our whole extended family. And so when I sat down and pressed record on that little mini cassette tape recorder, she started telling me not just about her life, but about her mother's life and her grandmother's life, back many generations. And I guess because she is herself a woman, it was very matriarchal. The stories that she knew were the stories of the women in our family. And so I kept notes and I kept those recordings, and I always knew I wanted to do something with them, but the time never seemed right. I was never in the right place, and my sort of emotional maturity and my understanding of self wasn't quite in the right place yet until right after October 7th, 2023, when we saw the kind of horrific retribution that Israel was taking on the people of Palestine. And it all of a sudden seemed very important to me, and sort of this Kairos moment, this right moment, ordained moment for these stories to, be birthed into the world. And I wrote it the way I did because literally had my grandmother's voice both in my head and on my computer. Those cassette tape recordings had been digitized by a friend of mine a number of years ago. And so I was able to bring them up and just hit play and just listen to my grandmother's voice. She's been dead since 2016, so it's been a number of years, but it was such a gift to be able to hear her voice again. And I just hit play, and I would just hear her voice even as I was writing, even if the recording wasn't playing, I could just hear her voice in my head, and I really wanted to capture that. So that's why this is a memoir written mostly in the first person, but not always me talking. Sometimes it's my grandmother and sometimes it's my great grandmother, in addition to a number of stories in between that are written in the third person. So that's how we ended up where we are today.
It's so amazing that you have those recordings.
Yeah.
Such precious uh, treasure to have those recordings and to have thought to do that at the age that you were when you did that. You know, one difference in our stories is my family are all over in Egypt, and
Yeah.
you know, every time I go to Egypt and sit with my family there, I learn so much more about those strands of my family history. But really applaud you for having had the foresight to do that, that you could circle back and really mine it at the right time during such a
Yeah.
Kairos moment.
Yeah, I do bless my former self. We all make mistakes when we're younger, but sometimes we get things right too. And I am just so grateful to my grandmother, but also to my former self to have the wherewithal to think to do that for sure.
Well, Leyla, I wrote to you as I was getting to the conclusion of your book to just note how your reflections on your own journey coming into your sense of identity really resonated with um, much of my own journey and my own struggle around that. I wonder how a full embrace of your Palestinian identity, your Arab identity, particularly as somebody like me who can be classified as white in the United States, how that has colored and shaped and changed your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's sort of many ways into it, and many nuances to it. But I think, I wasn't conscious of my Palestinian identity until I was a teenager. But that doesn't mean that it didn't exist, right?
Mhm.
Those are two separate things. My Palestinian identity always existed,
Mhm.
but I wasn't always conscious of it. And even when I became conscious of it, I wasn't always clear about my acceptance of it. And I would say now, my Palestinianness is sort of the main strand of my identity. I would say my Palestinianness and my faith, which go hand in hand anyways, are the sort of main strands of who I am. Um, and so that has in and of itself been something of a journey. Um, yeah, I think, tell me, I lost the train of thought. Tell me the question again, Adam.
Just how your embrace of that side of yourself and that journey of making that, as you say, the main strand of your
Yeah.
identity, how has that impacted you, shaped your perspective um,
Yeah.
as a
Yeah,
person,
especially as someone
priest?
who sort of
Yeah,
passes as white a lot of times.
right,
And I
right.
think that passing of white as white also, I mean, even that has shifted. Many of my older family members, my mom and her aunties and cousins, when I first started talking about myself as somehow non-white, as a person of
Hmm.
color, which seemed
Hmm.
really odd because, like,
Hmm.
looking at me, I'm clearly
Hmm.
white skinned, right? Um, when I started talking about myself as a person of color, my elders were really hesitant because they had spent so much time and effort and sort of energy, emotional energy assimilating. And the sort of passing as white is something that was really important to them for all sorts of reasons that we could spend hours talking about. Um, but as our culture has shifted, and as being Palestinian, being Arab, in both of our cases, has taken on different and new connotations in the culture at large in the West,
Mhm.
it has become really important to me to claim that identity as something non-white, right? As a person of color. And that has impacted so much, especially again, because someone looking at me makes all sorts of assumptions about who I am.
Mhm.
Um, and and in a lot of ways, I think I made a lot of assumptions about who I was bef over the years. So a great example is when we first started as a country really talking more about race, particularly after George Floyd was killed,
Mhm.
I engaged with a group of white clergy women. I think they were all Episcopalian, in reading Leyla Saad's book that I can't remember the title of now. That was geared towards white and white passing people to do the work of unpacking racism. And there was this section in the introduction of the book where the author makes a note to biracial, multiracial, um, and people of color who pass as white. And when I first read the introduction, I just assumed that that didn't apply to me because I was still in a lot of ways thinking of myself as a white person. But as I read the book with these friends and colleagues, and they were sharing with me their experience of growing up white in America, I began to realize how vastly different my experience was from theirs. I
Mhm.
mean, like different planets, different. Their
Mhm.
experience of whiteness was just something I had never experienced, I realized, in my life because I grew up in this Palestinian family, and coming to that realization was absolutely like an absolute significant change for me because all of a sudden I realized that it is really true that I'm a person of color because I have been shaped by this whole culture. And even though I don't experience the world as a person of color because people, I look so white and I carry that white privilege, um, I have I have sort of an insight into what it means to be Palestinian and to look Palestinian and to inhabit that liminal space and that place of in-betweenness and not belonging because of my upbringing, because of who I am, because of my identity. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but yeah,
Yeah,
maybe to
no,
weigh in.
well, and I know you and I have some overlap, I think, in our college years, and
Yeah.
I was the last college class to graduate pre 9/11. So I graduated
Mhm.
college from Boston University in the spring of 2001.
2001. Yeah.
And for me, that was a really pivotal and profound moment when that happened. As a native New Yorker who was still very much wrestling with my sense of identity and sense of self, um, and to see not just what happened on 9/11, but what happened on 9/12 and
Yeah,
9/13,
exactly.
9/14, right?
Yeah.
I was in Boston, but I was hyper aware in those days of how anybody who was perceived to fit the stereotype of an
Right.
Arab or a Muslim was in trouble, right? And knew that they were in trouble. And I saw people on the T in Boston, Muslims, Arabs with American flags in their backpacks,
Yeah.
sort of like as protection, right? Like, don't
Yeah.
attack me. I'm not one of them, right? And
Yeah.
it and I remember thinking, oh gosh, I'm Arab, right? But I can pass
Yeah.
under the radar as being not to some people, and so that
Yeah.
has protected me from the same kind of racism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's so much there to unpack, but one of the things I want to focus on is um, what you said at the very beginning, which I think is totally right, which was that anyone who could have been perceived as Arab or Muslim,
Mhm.
and I think that opens up a whole new world of conversation for you and me, especially because we are Arab Christians, and in our case, Arab Christian clergy, which sort of adds a whole different layer because there is this awful misconception that does so much damage on all fronts in the West and particularly in the United States that Arab and Muslim are exactly the same thing. And there's so much ignorance and so much lack of awareness about how separate those things are, right? Of course, there is some overlap, some extensive overlap maybe between Arab and Muslim, but the people who are Muslim are so much more than just Arabs, right?
Right,
And
right.
people who are Arabs have such a wide variety of faith traditions, and people in the West, your average white Western Christian just has no clue about that. And so just by existing, by you and I, just by existing and making people aware of our ethnic identities while we're
Mhm.
showing up in these spaces in our collars and our white skin, right, is such important work because it just does works at least a little bit towards breaking those misconceptions and helping people to understand what the reality is.
Yeah, well, and that leads into my next question. In the book, Leyla, you talk about life in Palestine before the Nakba, right?
Mhm.
Before the expulsion, and how there seemed, in many respects, to be a shared culture, right?
Mhm.
That broke down some of the barriers that we so often put up to simplify the long-standing conflicts. I wonder, in your experience, what is the biggest misperception of Palestine and Palestinians that you hear from people in the United States?
Um, God, there are a lot of
Mhm,
misperceptions.
mhm,
So it's sort of hard to narrow it down to just one that's the biggest. I would say that I think in the West, we tend to think of Palestinians as, first of all, almost like a different species, right?
mhm,
Like they're so separate from us in a way that no other ethnic, religious, any kind of group has to endure.
mhm,
Um, Palestinians to people in the sort of general Western world are there is no empathy for us. There is no hint of empathy. There is no ability that people have to put themselves in our positions, whether to put themselves in the position of the folks who are suffering terribly in Gaza or the folks in the West Bank, um, or even Palestinians in the diaspora, right? There's just no ability for folks in the West to imagine themselves in the position of Palestinians because they don't think of us as made up of the same flesh and bone. And
mhm.
That's really sad, and that's really infuriating, but it is also the reality we find ourselves in. And I think my work in the church and through the book is to break that misconception and to create ways in to the Palestinian experience that people can access, even despite their defenses that they have constructed in a lot of cases, in most cases, sort of out of ignorance, right? It's not like people wake up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to think badly about Palestinians. It's just what they've been taught. It's the Kool-Aid that we've all drunk growing up in this country. So I think that's the most harmful one. And there are many harmful ones, but that I think is the most harmful one for sure.
Yeah, well, and one thing that I have come to identify with as I have embraced that label person of color is the sense of internalized racism that can
Yeah,
often bubble to the surface in our part of the world. Because as I reflected back on my upbringing as a young person, and I was not as fortunate as you were to have Arab family close by
right.
to me, right? That I, in reflection, came to realize that I went through years of my young adulthood when I would almost blame the things I did not like about myself on my Arabness, right? Like,
Yeah,
if only I was more American, quote unquote.
yeah, yeah,
And I think as a young child, what did I mean by that? I meant white, right?
yeah,
Anglo-Saxon, right?
yeah.
And the Semitic features that that I
That are
became
stamped on your face.
right,
Yeah,
aware of, right? That's what I did not like about myself,
mm,
or that was in hindsight what I could be teased or bullied for as a
yeah,
child. What was my Semitic features, my
yeah,
Arabness, right? And it took a long time to get past that. But I think so often, whether it's Palestinians or Arabs writ large in our part of the world, we depict them as bad, as evil, as terrorists, right? First,
yeah, yeah,
or really identifying them as human beings, as children
yeah,
of God, as people just as deserving of human flourishing as anybody else.
yeah. I think that's true. And I think it's in large part why I feel so strongly about identifying myself as a person of color, precisely because, and I mean, you look much more Semitic, I think, than I do, right? Like you have even slightly darker skin than I do. Your face sort of reflects those features, whereas I got a lot of my
Mhm,
father's Irishness going on,
mhm,
right? Like,
mhm,
and the Palestinianness is there, but
mhm,
unless you know what you're looking for, it doesn't reveal itself instantaneously to people. People tend to really assume I am just plain old white like everyone else, right? Um, and it is that, I mean, this is where conversations about white privilege start to come into play. It is a privilege, which means that it is a responsibility I feel like I have, that I come across as white to
mhm,
people, generally speaking, because that gives me a kind of power that my Arab siblings who look much more Arab
mhm,
don't have. That
mhm,
gives me a kind of access into communities of power, right? And communities of privilege that a lot of my Arab cousins, right, don't experience on a regular basis. It means that, like you, I could very easily walk the streets
right.
after September 11th or October 7th, right? And no one would ever know that I have this identity that aligns me with the people who are identified as the evil ones in these scenarios, right? When I know, you know, they are not the evil ones. They are not the enemy. And so it becomes very important for me to claim that identity in a sort of much more public way than I think I would feel if I looked a lot more Palestinian than I do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the book too, you talk about how Palestinian Christians
Yeah.
specifically were sort of squeezed in some ways following the Nakba. You had
Mhm.
um, Zionists and Muslims, and they could
Mhm.
easily get lost. And I think Palestinian Christians so often continue to be lost
Mhm.
in the narrative. And so I wonder what you feel that Christians in our part of the world should keep in mind about the Palestinian Christian experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I Let me talk about the Episcopal Church,
Mhm.
particularly first. My experience of the Episcopal Church is that we as a church know that there is the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, right? We talk a lot about the Archbishop of Jerusalem. Um, and we take up an offering every Good Friday for the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. So it's not like people are completely unaware or ignorant that there are Palestinian Christians or that there are Palestinian Anglicans to some extent. But it's like, in my experience of the church, of the Episcopal Church, it's like there's a disconnect that people will talk about the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, will take up the offering, right? Will support the Al Ahli Hospital, will support the diocese in general. But it's like people in the pews don't realize that there are real human beings showing up to churches in that part of the world, to Episcopal and Anglican churches in that part of the world every single Sunday, right? Every single week and during the week as well. It's like they think the Episcopal Church thinks of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem only and solely as an institution and not as a organism of communities of faith and human people.
Mhm.
And that I find deeply frustrating about how we talk about and how we relate to our siblings in our own church, in the Holy Land. And it's part and parcel of what's happening in the wider society in the West, where, Palestinians aren't really human. They're sort of a separate species. So I, I think that's what I want to highlight most of all when we talk about the importance of understanding and listening to Palestinian Christians is in our church, especially the Anglicans, right? Especially the Episcopalians, but all Palestinian Christians, because those voices are so important to our understanding and our appreciation of what is happening in reality right now, what has happened in the past, and what we can look forward to and how we can hold on to hope for the future. Sometimes I'll show up in churches and I'll give my little spiel and I'll talk, and um people will say, well, when did your family convert? When did your family become Christian? As though Christian, I mean, if we think back, if we think about our scriptures, if we think about what we know about Jesus's life, we know that Jesus himself was a Galilean. We know that his first followers, his first disciples, were men of Galilee. Where is Galilee? Galilee is in historic Palestine, right? The first followers of the way of Jesus, before we were even called Christians, the first followers of the way of Jesus were Palestinian Jews. Jesus himself was a Palestinian Jew. And we in the church in the West, we in the Episcopal Church don't know that. We have not taken that in. We have not appreciated that for what it is. And we have just disregarded completely. We have forgotten about our siblings in the faith who identify as Palestinian Christians. And it is painful and hurtful to us as Palestinian Christians. And it is deeply damaging, I think, to our church to have forgotten that past and to have forgotten that ancestry.
Yeah, and as a deputy to our last general convention, sadly, there was an unwillingness to support a resolution that recognized Palestinians as indigenous to their own lands. Uh, and I, as you talk, Leyla, I can't help but think about the corrosive impact of Christian Zionism,
Yes.
this equating of ancient Israel that we read about in the Bible with the modern nation state of Israel,
Yes.
that I believe has a real hold on the faithful in the pews and many of our clergy, that just makes it all the harder, I think, um, to recognize all that you've been talking about. Talking about how ancient Palestinian Christians are, and as well as the inherent worth and dignity of Palestinian people.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think, what I have done, or what my mission is, and what the mission of the organization that I helped to co-found has been, is to tell those stories more and more, and to help the church remember its origins and remember who we are and where we came from, in an effort to, impact where we are going and change that course so that we can be better allies for our siblings in faith who identify as Palestinian.
Well, and talk a little bit more about that. So you are the founder or co-founder of PACA, Palestinian Anglicans and Clergy Allies, that I've become a part of. And can you talk about the genesis of that organization and what some of its work has been?
Yeah, thanks. So we got together, a number of us, Episcopal clergy women, all of us, started meeting shortly after October 7th, because it was actually not, I wasn't actually included at the very beginning. I was, as you can imagine, as I'm sure you were too, those first weeks after October 7th, when Israel's retaliation began on such a horrific scale, it was a deeply painful time. And it was hard for me to have conversations with people who didn't identify as Palestinian or Arab in some way, shape, or form. So it was actually a couple of clergy women who were talking among themselves about the conflict and the tension they were feeling, wanting to be more public about their solidarity and support for Palestinians, and condemn Israel's actions, but finding themselves in ministry contexts, congregational contexts, where they didn't know how to best do that. And soon after they started meeting with one another, they really, really asked me to come and be part of that conversation, because they knew they wanted my voice, and they wanted my input. And that was so key. It was a way of healing for me that I didn't even know that I needed, and I didn't think would be a way of healing, but it really was. And so I'm so grateful for them for that. And out of those initial conversations that then we began to have, we decided to sort of make an organization. We found that that connection that we were having, the ability to talk with one another about the struggle of being Christian clergy person in this context, knowing what was morally clear, but having finding it a challenge to state that moral clarity in our own contexts without too much backlash, that having those connections with one another was really, really helpful. And so we thought, let's broaden that network. And we're called Palestinian Anglicans and Clergy Allies, but really the group is open to any Palestinian Christians of any denominational background and clergy allies. So clergy of any faith, of any ethnic background, who want to stand in solidarity with our Palestinian siblings and take part in these conversations and get the fellowship and colleagueship and strength and courage to continue to speak up. So our group is generally open to anyone who wants to join, but the sort of core group is Palestinian Christians and clergy who are navigating those pastoral waters of trying to figure out how to speak truth and speak to justice, but in ways that remain pastoral and pastorally attuned to their own ministry contexts.
Well, and that leads me to really my final question, which is for lay folks who might be listening into this conversation. Obviously, I know they can go out and purchase your book, and I know it's now out on audiobook, and you can get it on a variety of platforms. But what would you say are other ways that those listening in might be able to learn more about Palestine, the Palestinian Christian experience? Do you have suggestions around that?
Yeah, I mean, there are tons of ways, and a lot of it is going to depend on what medium any particular person enjoys most. But there are podcasts, there are books, there are, essays and articles, there are documentaries, there are a number of social media sort of personalities that you can follow. So take your pick. I'll just mention a few here just so that people have some place to start. Yes, please find Daughters of Palestine. I would love that. But also there is, if you want a little bit more sort of theology, there are two Palestinian Christian theologians and writers. Mundra Isaac is one. He wrote The Other Side of the Wall and Christ in the Rubble. Those are two great books. And then the other one is, who I actually prefer, but he's a little bit more intellectual, I think, is Mitri Raheb. He wrote Decolonizing Palestine is a good starting place. And then he's just come out with an edited book, I think something after Gaza. I can't remember what the title is, but
I think Theology After
Gaza. There you go. So those are some great books to start with. But I also would encourage, if podcasts are more your style, Daniel Benura has a podcast called Across the Divide. So that's a great place to start. I just watched a documentary that was made in 2017, so before October 7th, called 1948 Creation and Catastrophe. I thought that was a really powerful and impactful documentary. So those are some good places to begin. PACA does have a resources tab on our website. So if you go to palestiniananglicans.org and click on the resources tab, that there are a number of options there to get you started. And I would say to anyone listening, like, please do go find out more, educate yourself, but then be a bit of an evangelist and find the stories, particularly of Palestinian Christians, that resonate with you and share them with other people. Buy them the book, share a book that you've read and enjoyed or that enlightened you, or just tell the story. Tell someone about a Palestinian Christian that you found on social media and are following. Have them follow, invite them to follow that person too, right? Just at a dinner party with friends, tell the stories of Palestinian Christians that you have gleaned from this work of self-education that you are doing. I think it's just, my other vocation is working with small churches. And a lot of times the small churches I visit and the small churches I talk to say, oh, we're so small. We don't have this. We don't have that. We don't have these resources. We don't have enough young families in church, da, 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 da. It's all about what they don't have and what they can't do. And my job is often to remind them, you have so much. There is so much you can do. And you don't have control over, you have no idea over what your small action in your small part of this corner of the world, you God is in control of what impact those actions and that ministry has. And God is totally capable of making your small action have a huge impact in the world around you. And I think that's true here, right? You might think, well, what difference is it going to make if I tell a story about a Palestinian Christian at a dinner party? It can make an enormous impact, and you may not ever know it. But that's the hope of our faith, right? And giving up that kind of control and letting God do that work and trusting that God will do that work is where we find ourselves.
Well said, Leyla. I think we'll leave it right there. Thank you so very much for making the time for this important conversation. And again, for those listening in, Leyla is the author of the new book, Daughters of Palestine, a memoir in 5 generations. Please go out and get a copy. Maybe we'll do a parish study on this and perhaps invite you back to
I
dialogue
love
on
that.
it. But thank you for those listening in. I'll be back next month for another edition of Rector's Corner. In the meantime, friends, you stay safe and well, and you keep the faith. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.